Good evening, everybody. Welcome to BrisScience, August 2023. I am your MC for this evening, Joel Gilmore. It is so fantastic to be back. If this is your first time with us, again, thank you so much for coming out. BrisScience is a series of free public lectures on science put together by the University of Queensland. And we aim to bring not just the best scientists, but also the best communicators to share their passion and their research with the audience of Brisbane and the world through the wonders of YouTube. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight and pay my respects to elders past and present. It's a great opportunity to reflect tonight, particularly when we're talking about composting and recycling and the future of our soils, to reflect on those people who've cared for this land for over 60,000 years and the history that we still can learn from today. So, little bits of housekeeping first of all. Tonight we're going to have a presentation. Afterwards there will be Q&A, which we will manage through a question app. So at some random interval after I say this, there will be a QR code up on the screen. Any moment. It's like a roulette every week. And you can scan that QR code, head to the website. Look at that. So close. And ask your questions there. You can ask them during the talk, or at the end we'll have a little bit of time and I will go through as many of those as possible and ask our speaker afterwards. However, there will also be the chance to chat with the speaker one-on-one at the end of the talk, and indeed amongst yourselves, because hopefully this will give you lots to reflect on, and to help that along we'll have some food and drink available outside, and we'd love for you to hang around and celebrate with us, at least before you go off to watch the Matildas game. Have I got that right? Great. YouTube. So, let's get into it. Now, at BrisScience, we make a habit of never trash talking our speakers, but we do like to have speakers talking about trash. So tonight, our speaker is the very multi-talented Professor Susanne Schmidt. And Susanne is a scientist and educator at the University of Queensland, where she and her team research plants, soil, and everything in between. Literally everything in between, looking at the idea of circular nutrient economies, the same way we think about a circular economy of minimizing waste, and building on that idea, looking at fertilizers, and of course, compost, which is what we want to talk about tonight. Talking about compost, recycling, and how science might help us think a little bit more deeply about some of these ancient and essential techniques. So here, with some compost for your brain, which sounds better before I say it out loud, please put your hands together for Professor Susanne Schmidt.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you everybody for attending. Like I thought you're probably all watching the soccer tonight, so thanks for being here and allow me to share my passion for compost. So the power of compost sounds a bit different to the artificial intelligence or latest breakthrough in medicine that you might be used to in these BrisScience talks, but I'm really hoping that I can share some of the good things that we can learn from and using compost in the best possible way. So I'm an agroecologist, which means I work in agriculture and in ecology, trying to sort of understand systems and hopefully improve them. And as you know, there's a big need that we sort of do things a little bit better for our sustainable future. So as Joel already mentioned, I'll talk about compost science, which sounds like an oxymoron, but hopefully you'll be convinced at the end of tonight that it's not, and the circular economy in agriculture, and also your contribution in all of this. So I'm going to start with a slide that shows you about the greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing in by just being humans and doing things on the planet. And most of that in the red is energy from transport and energy production. But about a quarter or 20% or so, thereabouts, numbers vary, it's to do with agriculture. So that's how much agriculture contributes to the greenhouse footprint. It also suffers, of course, from climate change. And I would argue agriculture should help solve climate change. And that's going to be part of what I want to talk today to you. But also landfill, that is also going to be one of the topics, also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, undesirable, of course, because it contributes to climate change. And compost will help address both problems, better agriculture, and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions from landfill. So, but I'm going to guide you through this, but first of all, a definition what composting actually is. And it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's an exothermic, aerobic, biological process applicable to any biodegradable solid organic material with a final product of pasteurized, stabilized organic matter. You go, wow. You might want to get up and leave right now. But exothermic means heat is involved. Aerobic means air is involved. Biodegradable, we probably all understand, so it's organic, so that means organic carbon is part of the molecular structure. And pasteurized, it means clean. And stabilized means obviously stable. So let's have a look in this. But where you think it might sound really trivial, and maybe some of you are composting in the backyard, modern compost manufacture and compost use is far from trivial and requires regulation, cooperation between different stakeholders, technology, and also ecological thinking to really crank up all the benefits that we can get. So that's going to be what I'm going to talk about. So obviously organic matter here on the left, and then a pile of organic matter that will be undergoing composting. And then in this petri dish here to my left is the little helpers, nature's little helpers, bacteria and especially fungi, that are absolutely essential in making compost. So, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about those. So compost or waste recycling has a long history, and I wanted to share that with you as I prepared for this. There's actually lots of things I learned, which is always good to prepare a public lecture. So the Sumerians, which you know was one of the ancient civilizations, they lived in these cities, and in those cities they actually stored some of their waste in stone pits, and then they used the waste on their fields that surrounded the city. So they had agriculture, and you know, agriculture only started about 10,000 years ago, so they used the organic waste from households and manures and so forth. But also other ancient civilizations like in China and Japan and South America, so they used waste. Often they piled them up or put them in pits, and often for long periods they left them in there before they would use them for intensive agriculture. But the first written evidence of composting actually comes from the 13th century. So that doesn't mean people haven't done it, but we don't know what they did. But written and quite scientific came from the Spanish Templar, in Spain, from the Templar Knights. If they weren't sort of riding nice horses and going on crusades, they were thinking about composting. And that is because they were settling in Spain, arid, clapped out, infertile soils that they tried to rejuvenate, and they did that using compost. And then modern composting is attributed as the indoor compost, and that's indoor not with a spelling mistake, but it's a city in India by an agricultural scientist, British scientist, Sir Albert Howard. So from the 1920s onwards, he was experimenting and again recycling all manners of organic waste from households, animal manures, and so forth. Whether or not people had done proper composting before that, we don't know, but this is what we find in the scientific literature. So how does this look today? Well, because I came up with this big mouthful of an explanation, I just thought I'd break it down. And quite a few of the slides today that I'm showing, I took from a very good handbook, the Composting Handbook, as it was called, that was only published last year, and quite a few people, including a compost expert here in Queensland, Johannes Biala, contributed to it. So I really recommend it if you want to get stuck into composting privately or professionally. It's a very good book. And the first picture here, you can see the thermophilic phase. So it's a heating phase where the temperature of this organic matter goes up to about 70 degrees, sometimes even a bit higher. Got to be careful, not too high, otherwise it will start to burn. And then it will become an immature compost, and then it's sort of a cooling phase, the so-called mesophilic phase, which means a sort of intermediate temperature, not too hot and not cold. And then you end up with humics and sort of more stabilized organic matter. So there's, through this sort of magic of microbial, fungi, bacteria activity, you get compost. And the interesting thing is, so it's a controlled process, but if you then put it into soil, and you can see here tons of organic matter added per hectare to a soil. If you were just using fresh waste, in other words, you just use fresh organic matter and you plonk it in your field, if you come back 12 months later, most of that would be gone. It's back to carbon dioxide in the air. Very little would remain. If you use compost, however, you can see there's sort of a little bit of a decline, but not as much, and so a lot of the organic matter will stay behind and has the potential to improve your soil. So So today's composting, depending where you live and what you do, ranges from very tiny. This was in the top here is when I was researching for this talk. In Japan, they're recommending that you can still, even in the tiniest of apartments, you can have a paper box, cardboard box, and make compost. Or you may be lucky and you have a public space where you can compost or your own garden. In this picture here behind me, they're windrow composting. So this is one of the big organics recyclers in Australia, and there's quite a few of them. So they make compost professionally and then can sell it on for various purposes. So compost is widely used, and you're probably aware of that, so to improve soil and to fertilize crops. So some compost has organic materials and also contains some of these fertilizer nutrients, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so forth. And you can see here how this one just spreads it on top of the soil. Here we have it where it may be incorporated into garden beds or beds for horticulture or broadacre agriculture. Here's a horticulture indoor production of salads and other greens, where again a lot of the high-value horticultural crops, they often use compost to crank up its high production. Here's compost under a macadamia farm or under plastic mulch in this very sandy-looking soil where the compost will do a lot of good, and I'll tell you more about that. And then this one here, this is a picture from California where they put compost into grassland and then monitored where the cows are going to graze. So these little black dots are all cows, a bit hard to see. And somebody drew in these blue lines, and that's where the compost went in this matrix, and you can see the cows seem to be clustering into that, and that's most likely because the grass tastes better, more nutritious, and the cows know it, so that's why they go there. So compost, in other words, can benefit soil both physically, make it maybe more, aerated, sort of looser chemically, so it can change various chemical properties, and also biologically, and that changes, increases the aeration of soil, water infiltration, also the storage of water, nutrient cycling, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but also suppress diseases that may otherwise attack your crop. And so, for instance, you can have a soil that looks sort of very brown and not so nice. You add compost and you get to much more darker, nicer looking soil that might have a lot of organisms in it, like earthworms and other things that can only live in the soil if there's organic matter. And then they can, have a food web in this rather than just maybe the pathogens that attack your crop. So crops tend to grow well with good compost. And here's just, again, not something for you to learn. Oopsie, hang on, that was not what I wanted. Oops, press the wrong button. Eek. Bloop. So this was, this is compost microbes that can perform what's called biological control. So rather than using a pesticide to kill a certain organism that attacks your crop, crops can benefit from the diversity of microbes that exist in compost. And if you work in this sort of space, there's certain bacteria like Bacillus subtilis is one that people often sort of like because it has a biocontrol property, so it controls a disease or pest or enhances the way your crop grows because it makes some nice things like happy hormones for plants, for example. So there's really good evidence that compost can do that. And just for those who don't know so much about soils, and most people don't, especially the soil biology is super complicated. And a few years ago, we made this diagram, and this is sort of from very tiny, below 1 micrometers to millimeter size, and then we put on this scale the bacteria that we know, maybe 5,000 or 6, maybe a few more species now, for an estimated 10 billion species. So you can see how few have been characterized. With fungi, we know about 100,000 or so fungi species, but there's an estimated 5 million fungal species. So there's a huge biodiversity that hasn't been discovered. So soil is really the last sort of frontier in this space. And then the bigger the organisms get, like earthworms, then we probably know half of them, whereas some of the others are not so well known. So that's a really rich field of investigation, and obviously of great importance if you want to do agriculture with fewer pesticides and chemicals added. So compost, however, differ in their properties. So if you say, well, Susanne, you talk about compost, but I should talk about composts with S on it. And here's here's a slide again from this amazing composting handbook where you can see there's composted chicken layer manure in the left column. Then there's feedlot from cattle, biosolids, so that's from sewage, urban-derived compost, that would be from households and parks, and other compost. So when you look through it, for instance, you can see, for example, pH, so how acidic, so the compost is generally neutral or slightly alkaline, but you can also see that, for example, the salt content, so that's what electric conductivity means, so the various values vary. But when you look, for example, to one that I'm particularly interested in my research is how much nitrogen is there, because that's what plants need most of when they grow. About 60% of what they suck out of the soil is nitrogen for growth. And you can see it ranges from 3,000 to 14. So depending what compost you use, you want to be careful not to put too much or too little. And again, I'll give you an example and some more information on that. So compost doesn't equate to compost. And maybe sometimes you want to mix things, or you want to have very targeted approach to using it. So this is a picture that one of our students drew up, who was a very good artist. And so what we hypothesized is that compost can replenish soil organic carbon and improve nutrient supply and nutrient cycling. And this is sort of a picture here first. On the left this is a natural system. So we have a diverse plant community with trees and other things, and they have roots in different depths, and the soil has a lot of nutrients, and SOM stands for soil organic matter, which is sort of often used synonymous with soil organic carbon, but it's all the other elements as well. And typical forest, things are circular, things go around, the dead leaves drop and get recycled and form new biomass. And when you look at soil, it's often very fertile because there's soil organic matter, and the nutrients are sort of part of it. And there's a very small pool of soluble nutrients that could get washed away. So very, very little gets washed away into the deeper soil. Whereas when we clear those forests and we change the nutrients, we change the soil, and then a typical cropping system, we often find there's much less soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. The nutrients, of course, get exported with the crop, so we have to add something. In this case, a bag of fertilizer is a symbol. So things go a bit different. And when you look into the soil, we find the soil is fertilized and less soil organic matter, and there's much more of these nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus, are soluble. So when the rain comes or when the farmer uses irrigation, those nutrients can get washed away. And we know that is a problem because it contaminates water, it causes problems, including algal outbreaks of the Great Barrier Reef, for example, that threaten the coral. So there's lots, and really what we want in agriculture, we don't want fertilized soil, we want fertile soil. We want something that is more like in the natural system, where things are more stable and less vulnerable to loss and less vulnerable to these fluctuations. So can we get there? Oh yeah, and I should explain so I explained the soil organic matter. I'll briefly say what BNF means. It's biological nitrogen fixation. So that's when you have bacteria that actually convert air dinitrogen into plant available or bioavailable nitrogen, which is 70% of the air we breathe is dinitrogen, and only special bacteria can turn this into fertilizer, or we do it with a Haber-Bosch, which is a chemical process that requires a lot of energy. So humans can make fertilizer, and that's good on one hand, but it's also somewhat problematic because we make a lot, and that contributes to pollution and some problems that I'll mention later on. But first of all, going back to the soil organic carbon, I said replenishing soil organic matter is really important because we have lost a lot of it. So this picture shows a landmark paper from my colleague Jonathan Sandeman in the US. So he shows that 10,000 years ago, when agriculture started, he set this at 0.0, and then he monitored and estimated how much carbon was lost from soil. So this is grazing land and cropland, sort of in today's time, and this is how much soil carbon has been lost in conjunction with the increase in converting natural ecosystems into grazing land or cropland. So we have a carbon debt of about 116 billion tons, and you say, well, then this doesn't quite match. This is a correction to the original paper. So they got it slightly, a few billion tons down. So again, it's very hard to get exact estimates, but this is pretty accurate. And the soils have been degraded, of course, because of this carbon loss. And the air, our atmosphere, has gotten more carbon dioxide than, from those degrading soils. So the soil organic carbon has been converted to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which contributes to climate change. And those pictures, like here, the cows standing on this sort of degraded soil, or every time the farmer drives her tractor across the field, she may disturb the soil and may release some of the CO2 that comes from the soil organic carbon pool. So, and obviously you already know where I'm going, right? Compost is going to be one of the cures, but I also want to highlight that critics would say that compost can be very negative. It can have a negative impact on crop yield, and that's important. If you're a farmer, you can't afford to have less yield, right? You want the same or more yield with whatever you've been doing. Soil health can be impacted, and also greenhouse gas emissions can increase. So I'm a professional on the fence sitter because I'm a scientist, right? Scientists can never just say, look, this is perfect and let's go this way. We always have to say, well, but what here, what about there? We need to pull all of the information together, and then often what we find, it's not just one thing forward, but there's facets, there's nuances, there's sort of this may work in this case, but there's another case over here that needs a different approach. And that's what science really is. It's sort of dissecting it and then comparing things. So we took a scientific lens to compost use globally, and we looked at nearly 300 published studies in the scientific literature with 2,000 observations, which is quite a lot, and quantified the effects of compost, of just using compost, just using mineral fertilizer, or using a combination of compost and mineral fertilizer. And we took 3 variables that we tested or analyzed, one being crop yield. Of course, that's a no-brainer, especially with the critics saying, oh, compost, it could be a problem. Soil organic carbon, because we all know that we need organic carbon. And then also nitrous oxide emissions, which is a very nasty greenhouse gas. It's 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide, so it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. And you don't want that, higher amounts. You want, again, less, not more. And this was published last year in a journal called Nature Food, and I just want to highlight the main person who did all, most of the heavy lifting, which is Xiaozheng Zhao from Beijing. He's from the China Agricultural University, and I've been working with quite a few colleagues literally since my days when I was an honors student in Germany, when they were doing PhDs there. So that's how long we've known each other. And then also a British colleague, Dave. So let's have a look. What did we find? So this title, by the way, the journal came up with. I would have not chosen this title. I like short titles. A precision compost strategy aligning compost and application methods with target crops and growth environments can increase global food production. Whew, I know. But you get the idea, right? They didn't talk, the carbon story comes in, but that would have quickly killed the title anyway. When a journal says we're publishing your work, you just go, okay. So no further complaints. So I want to talk you briefly through some of the findings, because remember how I said the critics often said compost can have a problem with yield. And what this diagram shows is, so everything on 0 is the standard, which is just using mineral fertilizer, which is what most farmers do. They use mineral fertilizer, so anything on that means that's the yield, the relative yield with mineral fertilizer. Anything where it goes negative is less yield than with mineral fertilizer. Everything going this way means more yield than mineral fertilizer. So again, you can probably see what the story is. With compost, we find throwing all of those 2,000 observations in one big bag and shaking it up, this came out 10% less yield, and this is nearly 300 observations, so quite a large pool. With compost mixed with mineral fertilizer, and again, this is comparing same but with same, so there's lots of controls in this, nearly 650 or so observation, you can see 16% higher yield. So we thought this is good, right? So there's obviously yield benefits, and you may know if you do plant breeding, if you get like a couple of percent more yield out of something, people get the champagne glasses out. So we were very happy with this. But what about soil organic carbons, SOC, as we said? And again, you can see with compost, about 37% more carbon in the soil, organic carbon, and 32 with mineral fertilizer and compost combined. So again, very good outcome. So we can answer that question. Compost can increase the soil organic carbon levels. And then last one, you remember, nitrous oxide, this really nasty greenhouse gas. And here things go a bit all over the shop. And one thing you may notice, we have also very few observations. It's quite hard to measure greenhouse gases, expensive, you need equipment, it's time consuming, and it's very variable. So we have instances where we get less nitrous oxide, but we also have some where we get more nitrous oxide. So, and because we had not that many observations, it's something which we had to park in the background, but we recommend that we need to do a lot more work on this. And again, I'll show you some data a bit further on from our research just up in the Sunshine Coast on this. So again, ignore some of the panels here. I want to highlight 3 that I left not blanked out. That compost with added fertilizer consistently generates yield benefits, but that soil and climate modulate those benefits. And you can see here the soil texture. If you have very sandy soil, you get quite, nearly 50% more yield. If you have very good soil, like loam or clay loam, so they are texturally very nice soils, the compost doesn't have such a strong effect, or the compost, again in blue is the compost plus mineral, and red is the just compost only. And again, if you have clay soil, so very dense soil, very gloggy soil, adding compost again cranks up the yield significantly. The same is true when you have soil with different pH levels. So if you have an acidic soil, you can see there's really good benefit, and that is because compost, as you may remember early on, is neutral or often alkaline, so it neutralizes the pH in the soil and makes crops happier, and that effect is sort of less if you go into alkaline soil, because then you don't get that sort of benefit. And then on the last slide here, MAP stands for mean annual precipitation, so in other words, annual rainfall. And so if you have an arid zone ecosystem or agricultural system, then the effects are not as strong, but you still get a yield increase with compost plus mineral fertilizer. But in semi-arid, so these sorts of lots of what Australia is, you get quite a significant effect. Same with in humid sort of ecosystems. So compost can really make a difference to yield there. And so in conclusion, current uses of compost do not maximize benefits. When we just looked at compost, we found improved yield and soil organic carbon only in about 30% of studies. So out of this slide, 30% good, 70% not really. In having both yield and CO and soil organic carbon. But we want both, of course. And this compost plus mineral fertilizer looks a bit better. We have 71% of studies had both better yield and more soil organic carbon. So that was good. But it means there's room for improvement. We then took a data-driven approach, so took all those numbers and cranked them through some more calculations, and to estimate what, if you did this globally, so you take everything in the world, you give them grid cells, and you calculate what's there and how you can improve it, and then we calculated that, or estimated, I should say, so it's, there's an uncertainty range, of course, that we can restore nearly 20 billion tons of carbon into agricultural soils, which is about nearly 26% of current soil carbon levels in the top 20 centimeters of the soil. We can boost global production of just the major cereal grains, for which we did this calculation, by 4% globally, and that's 96 million tons annually. And if you know, Australia produces about half of that in a good year, so it's twice the national production, just in Australia. And then it can increase crop yield, however, in those challenging soils that I showed you in the previous picture. So if it's dry, warm climates with challenging soils, those very sandy or clay soils, crop yield can go up by up to 40% on average. So that's pretty good. And the picture here shows one of our field sites in South Australia at one of our industry partners, and these are very, very sandy sort of soils and sort of with rainfall challenge. So again, compost will have a big impact in these soils. So the next steps means we need to increase recycling organics. We need to unite consumers, compost industry, farmers, and regulators, and have also research to optimize compost use for target crops and environments. And this will be, looking at food security, soil fertility, climate change, all of those things together. So we have a working program. But I want to give you some examples, and then I zoom into more on what you can do as well. So first example is where we did some studies up at the Sunshine Coast, and this is here some baby sugar cane when it's young. And these are the kind of chambers that we use to measure greenhouse gases. So we put them on the soil, leave them on there for an hour or so, and then we take out the greenhouse gases and analyze them back in the lab. And you can see here this nitrous oxide that I'd mentioned, the nasty greenhouse gas over the first sort of 40 days after fertilizer goes on, or these different products. And you can see if we had manure plus compost in green, we get the highest amount of nitrous oxide, even higher than when we use conventional nitrogen fertilizer. If we just use manure and some sorbents, bentonite or biochar, we could reduce those emissions. So that's, of course, desirable. And what we haven't done, and shown here in the purple, is adding those three things together where we have manure, compost, and then sorbents. So these sorbents literally hold some of the nutrients in place so they don't get gobbled up by bacteria that actually generate the nitrous oxide. So in other words, we can optimize it, and we should optimize it. Just using compost may not work for everything we want to do. A second example is sort of from also a study that we did a few years ago, and this also on sugar cane, and we used a range of biofertilizers, so again manure and other things, and we saw that it could increase the nitrogen use in sugar cane. So we needed less fertilizer. These nice colors here. This is at one side, the other side didn't show an effect, but I just show you the one that did. Where you can see this is sort of no nitrogen added, 120 kilos or 72 kilos, so we can drop the rate and then adding up a few different things. You can see the yields look pretty good. And these sorts of confusing looking things are basically just to show you that you can take soil and analyze all of the microbes in it, just like people do when you have your gut microbiome sequenced, for example, to see whether you can have, increase your health. We do the same thing in soil, so we can see whether there's an effect, and we can see which microbes increase or decrease to see what the benefits are, even though it's still an area that needs a lot more investigation. But overall, this key story is this is good news. We need less mineral fertilizer, and we get towards a circular nutrient economy where we start recycling things much more effectively. And this is sort of now some farmers and industry people who we work with. So there's Tony Rossi. He has a few brothers. He has a farm. They have a farm south of Cairns. And Tony Rossi, they make compost, and here you can see him on the tractor with a shovel full of compost. And he said, we have almost half our fertilizer inputs, which is so much better for the environment, and our crop yield is the same. But he also reached out, or we're talking, and we're working there now, how one of the students, honor students who's here tonight, he is testing the soil to see what things are good and what things could be improved, because the farmers recognize the need for science to really optimize it, and I'll show you that in earlier slides how there can be detrimental effects as well. And then the other picture here is from Peter Wodowitz. He is an organics recycler, and he has done that for 50 years. He's a real spokesperson. He pushes for quality compost. He pushes for effective organics recycling to really maximize the benefits, and that's benefits for everybody. And again, one of our students, Michael Walsh, who is working on this as PhD, and they're working on these pellets. So these are little pellets that can be used instead of loose compost. So for certain applications, especially for transport, you can make compost pellets, and you can put other nutrients in it, like from mineral fertilizer or other recyclates, in order to make it a really good fertilizer. So compost, in other words, can help Australia's waste problem. And you probably might have watched already the War on Waste. The third episode is sort of running. It's very sobering, I think, and very essential that we all contribute. We cannot keep throwing things out and sweeping them under the carpet or into landfill. And I want to spend a bit of time now to talk about food organics, garden organics, or FOGO, as it's also called, because over half of our household waste that we're producing is these food organic, garden organics, and it's more than 7 million tons that enter landfill every year. And that costs a lot of money, up to over $300 per ton, and the prices are going up. And that's ratepayers' money, of course. And most importantly, that organic waste that rots in landfill, because it's not the aerobic process, the aerated process that I talked to you about earlier. It's sitting In landfill, it's rotting, there's no oxygen, and that's why methane is produced, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas as well. It's 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and that contributes at least 5% to national greenhouse gas emissions. And I just read a paper recently where they could show that some of the big cities globally, 50% of the greenhouse gases that they produce is from rotting landfills. So much organic waste goes in landfills, and it's got to stop. So council diverting FOGO, these food organics, garden organics from landfill, can save millions of dollars annually, and that's, of course, really important. If you want to read a little bit more, we wrote a piece in The Conversation recently, The Case for Compost, Why Recycling Food Waste is so much better than resending it to landfill. And I just want to give you another example that's from some of the work we did with different crops to see how we can use this food organics, garden organics compost in growing crops. So this is in our own glasshouses at UQ. So we see silver beet here with mineral fertilizer, compost pellets. PPB is a type of bacterial biomass that the engineers use bacteria to suck nutrients out of liquid waste like pig slurry. And then we dry that and use it as an organic, concentrated and organic nutrients and mineral fertilizer in various proportions. And you can see, or just compost and mineral, or just pellets in various proportions. You can see they all grow pretty much the same. So we can replace fully or partially the mineral fertilizer and just use recyclates. And then something interesting with that we didn't expect, but again, people had described in other crops that compost can also change the way crops grow. And I'll just show you one benefit here where we've grouped tomatoes in sand or in sand plus 5% compost. And you can see the compost-grown tomatoes had faster fruit ripening. So again, if you're a producer of horticulture, that may be really useful because you may be harvesting quicker than otherwise. And now I'd like to show you a little video that hopefully pulled some of these things together. And if I click go.
But she's doing her bit for the planet by separating her food scraps from her general rubbish.
I think it's pretty easy to use. It's just like another way of recycling, I suppose.
She's on the second floor, so takes her food waste down to the bins in the basement, which include what's called a FOGO bin. But not everyone's on board.
I do think people have definitely got confused in my experience. Like I'll go to put my rubbish in there and I'll see there's like plastic bags or non-biodegradable bags or sometimes like nappies and things like that.
There you go.
It's an all too common problem according to this processor of organic waste in Sydney.
A whole load of red bin rubbish just thrown in the green bin.
This is what he's looking for.
A bag looks good. That's what we want. Just food waste in that bag.
It takes a long, involved process to decontaminate the waste, including a team of staff who have to manually remove the contaminants, everything from plastics and glass to clothes.
So there's a lot of people out there that really don't care. They think that recycling is a joke. It's not. We're deadly serious.
FOGO, which stands for Food Organics and Garden Organics, was introduced 14 years ago by a council in Sydney. Since then, 27% of the country's 563 councils have introduced the system, and 16% collect garden waste only. The system saves food from rotting in landfill sites and adding to carbon emissions.
At the moment, half of what goes into the general waste bin is food waste, and that's a resource that could be used a lot more carefully than going to landfill, where it gives off methane, which is damaging to the environment.
As opposed to being recycled into millions of tons of compost for gardens and for farmers to grow food.
There's an endless market in agriculture, providing we can remove the contaminants, and basically ends up back in the soil as a carbon source and a nutrient source.
The federal government has set a new goal for all metropolitan households to recycle their food waste by 2030. To achieve this, the composters say there will need to be changes.
To do a proper FOGO rollout, you've got to look at the size of that red bin. This is the key to the whole thing. If the red bin is too small, you're never going to get on top of the contaminants.
Good food comes from good land. Good land comes from good soil.
While they say many councils are getting it right with low contamination rates, public education before, during and after the rollout of FOGO is vital. Claire Moody, ABC News.
Cool. So that was pretty informing, I thought. So we should, however, I would like to point out that we should avoid food waste. So it's not, that's the first thing. And the Fight Food Waste CRC, the Cooperative Research Center who is sponsoring our research, they have released a very good toolkit. So if you're interested in, if you think I have too much food waste that I'm producing, have a look at this toolkit. It's very good. But the unavoidable food waste that you're still producing, the potato peels and the pumpkin peels and so forth, that should go either in your own compost bin or go into the designated council bins, especially as they're getting rolled out increasingly. And then another important story, of course, that you just saw from this video is that to keep the organics clean, so don't put other things in it, and then to use the compost to grow things, on your windowsill, in your garden, or allow farmers to use it. So for FOGO recycling alone, people have estimated it's more than 6,000 jobs in Australia. So these are new jobs that might replace some jobs in other industries that are not going to go forward. And only 200,000 hectares of Australia's more than 4 million hectares of farmland are currently receiving compost. So there's plenty more that can use it. And it, as I explained to you earlier, it really improves the efficiency of farming if it's done well. And some of these pellets that I mentioned, or larger granules, and these are also some that already exist commercially. So there's a lot of people developing things, and that's really a good thing to complement or replace current fertilizers. And the circular nutrient economy I'm very passionate about, and it's nearly a story for another day, but I want to throw this in here because when you use, for instance, these are farmyard cattle manure, so the cattle manure is not used efficiently in many instances. And globally, just the synthetic fertilizer versus animal manure and also human manure, this is how much nitrogen is in these wastes and synthetic fertilizers. So if we use those much more efficiently, we could shrink this part of the synthetic fertilizer, which I explained earlier is problematic because it dissolves in soil, becomes available. And in these, you might have seen this diagram. So this is from a part of the Conference of Parties where all countries get together discussing climate change and the future of the planet. And so everything in green is still okay, yellow is sort of gets a bit iffy, increasing risk, and red is sort of high-risk zone. And you all know that biodiversity loss is a major problem, so genetic diversity is faster declining than it should be. But those phosphorus and nitrogen, the biochemical flows, have received far less attention. And yet that's a big problem because of the pollution of water and effects on ecosystems, as well as the greenhouse gases that I mentioned. So compost will really tackle some of these, and the nutrient recycling will allow this to start solving this problem. So yeah, so that's my last slide, and I wish us all a green and happy future, and healthy, of course. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. We'll give you a moment to grab a drink if you'd like to.
Sure.
While there is the QR code there if you don't already have it. So if you would like to ask a question, I can already see a bunch coming through in the chat. Don't forget, of course, we will be back next month with another BrisScience. Details to be coming soon, so sign up to our mailing list or our website to be notified of when the tickets are available. And of course, this talk and all of our past talks are available on YouTube. So hop on there, look up BrisScience, and we'd love some comments or any thoughts on those. All right, if you'd like to join us on stage again, Suzanne, we will go through some questions here. So let's start off with some, tips for composting. Will asks, should you put cooked food into compost?
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem. You probably don't want to have like loads of meat and things in it. So yeah, but that's no problem. I think the main thing with composting is that you aerate it, so you don't let it rot. And so I personally like these tumbling bins, although my husband, who luckily isn't here today, but he would say that I don't even know where the compost bin is in our garden, which of course is a total. But he does most of it, I have to admit, yeah.
Jenny asks, if I live in an apartment, what is the best composting strategy for me?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I mean, if there's probably more of these small ones. I don't know how good this cardboard box business is that I showed, and to what extent a small bin that is, so you stop creatures from going into it. But like I said, it's a sort of aeration and the tumbling that's needed, and often if it's too wet, like if you've got lots of soggy things in it, that's not good either. So that's why if you have a garden, you put lawn clippings in. But if composting in an apartment is an option, then definitely using the compost bin or the FOGO bin, if once that sort of gets in, or the green bin would be the way to go. And then it can go to compost in professional composting facilities. Yeah.
Great, which leads to John's question. And I know there's a little bit of this available, but when is FOGO going to be available in Queensland?
Good question. I don't know if anybody is online or here from the Queensland government. We know they're working on it really hard, because I think all the states are now pushing for this. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, we use our own composting at home, or then, the green bin, of course, that you can also order, can have the food waste in it too. So.
Anyone from Queensland government want to speak up?
No? Well, you might all want to send an email though, just going tick, tick, let's get onto it, yeah.
Amazing. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions about climate change and compost, which I think you sort of touched on a little bit later in the talk perhaps, but this broad question of how will composting affect climate change?
Yep.
And maybe you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think it could really help to mitigate climate change by not having things rotting in landfills, so tick, by making sure that this organic carbon stays as organic carbon, go back into soil, to recarbonize soils, which is part of the 4 per mil initiative that you may have heard of, that was first discussed at one of the Paris Agreement. So if 0.4% of carbon would go back into the soil, then we would it would steady the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So we wouldn't keep creeping up, it would level out, and that would give us time to come up with renewables and other strategies to decarbonize our economy, basically. So soil is very much, compost is very much part of it, or not just compost, but anything that helps soil to recarbonize, but compost would be a logical thing. And of course, reducing these emissions from agriculture. And I didn't talk that much about it, but nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas, and lots of it comes from fertilized soils, and we need to stop this. And compost, in a nilly-willy way, you could still create problems. So that's where science comes in order to optimize it. So that's why we might need to have optimized products that will work for your particular spot, in particular crop, in a particular position, to make sure that everything is kind of ticked off. Yep.
Right. All right. Izzy would like to know, what do you think the risk of PFAS will have on the composting industry and market uptake? Which is per and polyalkyl fluoride substances?
Something like that, yeah. No, they call them forever chemicals, and there's a whole bunch of them, so they are very hard to break down. And they're in our daily lives. They make water repellency and things. But there have, of course, been in firefighting form in the case of PFAS. So there have been in the media a lot because of contaminants and people being worried, and rightly so, that it's in water and food and others. So, of course, if it's in our food, in our lives, and it ends up in the compost, then of course it can come back in the food. And I did, in preparation of this talk, I did talk to the environmental toxicologists that we have at UQ, and they've been doing studies on compost throughout Queensland, and so far it looks all good. So there's a threshold of the sort of contaminant level that's allowed. But again, the main thing is that we should phase out these chemicals so they don't come back and bite us, because every rubbish that goes into compost will come back in some form. So whether that's plastic bags or, but yeah, I think the risk, the way the experts told me is low at this point. Yeah.
That's great to hear. All right, we're going to keep it classy, but Diana, you know what's coming next. Diana wants to know, we're talking about circular economies and nitrogen. What role can human urine play, both in our gardens and for agriculture?
Yeah, that's a good one. So you can, of course, human urine is actually quite amazing because it's got a really good composition of nitrogen and phosphorus, so it's quite good fertilizer. And so people collect it in their own house and they use it in their gardens, or they use it on their, garden beds and other things. I know in Sweden they're commercially using it already, so they're collecting it. Also in the Netherlands they have urine separating toilets, so the solid waste gets separated from the urine. And there are fertilizers that you can buy based on urine. And there's also, people are starting to do it in Australia, but not quite as advanced, I suspect. But yeah, it's a perfect way of recycling nutrients, because the food we eat, we draw the energy from it, and once we are fully grown, most of these nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, calcium, everything gets expelled in our waste. And so that's what the sort of circularity would mean. Yeah, so urine is, in other words, a good one.
Great question. I've one or two more?
Sure.
Fantastic. And then we're going to go get some food and which we're not going to leave any food waste behind, obviously.
God, no.
Questions about, sorry, I'm just a whole bunch of new ones have come in, so I'm just quickly flicking through. Yes, we've covered off FOGO. So I think there's a range of questions here about your experiences now being a researcher in this space. Is there anything that you have learned or changed in your behaviour having done this research, things you didn't know before starting?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I've always worked on nutrients in some form or other, but I hadn't quite appreciated compost. And that was literally only started when I was asked by the Chinese colleagues and the British colleague to work together on this. So yeah, we spent quite a bit of the COVID years mulling this over, so it was a really good way of distracting yourself from ourselves from the pandemic and doing something useful. So yeah, I'm really passionate about it. And like I said, we compost at home, but that's generally my husband's job. So I always say I'm overqualified. No, don't tell him that. Don't tell him. So
no one will ever know except everyone on YouTube.
Exactly.
And thanks to Sabrina and Madison and a few others for that question. Look, all right, very last question I'll put to you, which is, you are approached by a wealthy billionaire, we'll call him Gil Bates, and he offers you all the money you can have to implement a program of your choice across Australia. What would you be doing?
I would set up sites with farmers and composters and government regulators and others, and monitor things for the long term, including how does the carbon build up in the soil, what sort of tweaks can you make, what technologies and science can you use, and also measuring greenhouse gases, and to really kind of turn this idea into reality for maximum benefit. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Gil, if you're watching, we've got some great opportunities in Australia.
Yeah.
On that note, I'd love you all to join us and prepare for some composting. A huge round of applause for Susanne. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And we will see you all next month. Have a good evening.